Hello and welcome to the Project Good podcast. I'm your host, Anne-Marie Hilton. Project Good is a social impact podcast interviewing experts and advocates about the pressing problems that we face globally and hearing how they suggest we move forward in the future. The Project Good podcast is brought to you by Project Good Work. The goal of this podcast is to inspire people and organizations to develop a mindset that can move others to positive action regarding the complex social issues facing people on the planet. For April, we're focusing on equity and in the environment. Today, I have the pleasure of interviewing Hana Creger, a senior program manager focused on environmental equity at Greenlining, which is a multifaceted advocacy organization whose efforts address the root causes of racial, economic, and environmental inequities in order to meaningfully transform the material conditions of communities of color in California and across the country. The organization acts as an incubator of new policy ideas. As an environmental equity program manager, Hana contributes to the development and implementation of policies leading to clean transportation and mobility investments in California that result in positive health, environmental, and economic outcomes. Her work is focused on the intersection of transportation, climate change, and economic opportunities for low-income colors of community. Let's get into the interview. First, let me introduce my guest. Hana, Senior Program Manager focused on environmental equity at Greenlining. She contributes to the development and implementation of policies leading to clean transportation and mobility investments in California. Her work is focused on the intersection of transportation, climate change, and the economic opportunities of low-income communities of color. She has been the lead author of several reports, with her most recent being Clean Mobility Equity, a playbook, lessons from California's clean transportation programs. In addition, she serves on a number of advisory committees for cities, agencies, universities, and nonprofits for projects relating to shared mobility. Welcome, Hana.
Hi, happy to be here.
So happy to have you, and thank you so much for taking time with us out of your busy schedule. So before we get into the questions and to set the stage, I'd love to hear from you your definition of environmental equity.
Yeah, no, it's a great place to start. And I think people will have various definitions across the board, but just to kind of draw out the difference between environmental equity versus environmental justice, and this is just from Greenlining's perspective, but environmental justice is more so concerned with preventing the environmental bads. So reducing pollution, maybe closing down an oil refinery near a neighborhood. Environmental equity works more so to bring environmental goods into those same communities that are experiencing disproportionate pollution. So increasing access to electric vehicles or solar panels or green jobs. And so obviously these two kind of concepts and strategies have to happen at the same time. They have to be coordinated, but in a lot of ways they're kind of working on kind of almost different ends of the spectrum.
Okay, so I would say that it's almost like the social work end of the environmental, the fight against the all the climate change and problems and challenges in the environment. That's how I would look at it.
Yeah, definitely. And you need both at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And then I guess, what would you say, how does environmental inequity, how is it affecting low-income individuals and minorities?
Yeah, so you have to almost look way back in history to understand why environmental inequity and injustice most impacts low-income folks of color. But specifically looking at one policy from the 1920s, which was called redlining, which really continues to shape our cities today. Redlining was essentially forced residential segregation, where communities of color, particularly Black, Latino, Asians, in some cases even Jewish communities, were forced to live in certain areas of cities away from white communities. And these areas were more often than not located in undesirable areas that were, near polluting industries. Later in the following decades, highways would be built through these neighborhoods. Toxic waste sites would be, dumped near these communities. And so over the years, these communities have become extremely overburdened by pollution and toxins, which has led to all kinds of detrimental health impacts today. And at the same time, like those are the environmental bads, but then kind of back to the environmental equity conversation, those same communities today have much harder time accessing all of the kind of sustainable programs, the green technology, the types of assets that are now helping us to address climate change, but they're not getting to those same communities. And that's why, we need environmental equity policies to help rectify that.
Now, I guess I don't mean to sound, insensitive, but why then, how does this, affect everyone, or why would this be important to everyone? Just because if, low-income communities and minorities have been, I would say, sidelined, why is it important then that we come together and try to take those communities out of that situation?
Yeah, the reality is that, first of all, environmental issues are economic issues, right? The impacts of climate change as a result from essentially, environmental pollution and racism. Climate change is going to affect everyone. Of course, it'll impact low-income folks of color first and worst. But no matter, how wealthy you are, you can't escape that either. And at the same time, like climate change is going to take, it already is taking a huge toll on our economy. And if we don't pay for it now, we are going to pay for it heavy in the following years. The racial wealth gap plus climate disaster, both of those things, again, take huge tolls on our economy. And it's honestly, we're operating at a loss by not addressing both of those issues.
I know that it's the UN right now, they have their 2030, that all the things that they want to get in place. And so, right now, obviously, we just had a pandemic, which I don't think anybody was planning for. So that's only, 9 years out now. And one of the things that I was reading in your report on the clean mobility, which I want to dive into a little bit, is that the UN wants to get a whole global infrastructure in place by 2030, which I think is aggressive, and I don't know, if it can be done. And I know your report addresses a number of programs and the different ways that people are implementing these different pilot programs and incentives to hopefully work towards this area. What is the likelihood that that all this infrastructure can actually take place in the next, I'll just say decade, because I'm just going to count 2020 out?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the good news is that we already have all of the technologies at hand. We know exactly what we have to do to solve climate change. It's not some mystery that we can't figure out. The one barrier is the social and political willpower. But I think if, this last election in the US is any indication, like political willpower can change fast, and it is changing fast. Where we're at right now with, the Biden administration, his new commitment to climate change, racial justice, his new infrastructure and jobs plan, I think that's an indication of when we want to, we can move quickly. And so given that, like I said before, we have the technology at hand, it's just about getting the right people in power to, help fund the kinds of changes we need. But at the same time, we need communities at all levels holding our politicians accountable to get us in all of this in place by 2030.
I guess the other question I have then is that now just thinking of low income and minority communities. And this is just from coming just from my perspective, but I'm sure this is something that you have encountered too, is that, it's good to get the infrastructure in place, but obviously it takes a whole mindset change. And so I guess looking at your report, I guess how or what programs or how are people working first to, I guess, change the mindset in these communities that can make it possible that this infrastructure and, having electric cars and all of that can be implemented?
Yeah, I would say, in large part, we're all essentially kind of prisoners of a system that has not really allowed us to always, make the most sustainable behavior changes. And so I'd really like to actually take the onus off of the individual and focus on how can we create a system where the easiest, most affordable option is for someone to choose an electric vehicle over a gas vehicle, is to recycle instead of throw something away. And how do we create a system that reduces those barriers to access, that targets those resources and incentives to the people that need it most? Because at the end of the day, of course, individual actions are important. Of course, individual responsibility is critical, but it's that collective action, when all of us are working in the same direction, that's going to have that impact. And so as advocates and policymakers, we have to create those kinds of systems and programs. And the ones that are highlighted in the Clean Mobility Equity Report are great examples of that. That really does kind of take our equity approaches and strategies to the next level in terms of prioritizing, people who live in polluted communities who are, extremely low income, and saying, we're actually going to prioritize these resources to these communities who need them most.
And so what are some actions that individuals in society can take to help the environment that are unexpected or new? One of the biggest things, obviously, is everybody's told to recycle, recycle, recycle. Is there something new that people can start doing?
Yeah, of course, there's the general things think about buying an electric car, look into the financial incentives that government provides, recycle. But again, it's I don't want the onus to be on individuals. I don't think that's fair when the system has not necessarily has been set up for us. But at the same time, I think the most impactful things that each individual can do is to organize, to get educated on the movements that they can join, to strategize, to donate to those organizations doing great work, to figure out how they as individuals can participate in campaigns or political actions, and also voting in the right politicians and not stopping there and holding them accountable if those politicians that represent them are not voting right when it comes to climate or environmental issues. And so just staying engaged at every step of the way, I think is the best thing that individuals can do.
Okay, great. How would you say one of the things that we had briefly spoke about is how can governments, not just the U.S., but just in general, advance clean mobility equity to address the climate change problem?
Yeah, one of the big takeaways from this report we just published is that electric vehicles are not enough. Electric vehicles are not a silver bullet solution. They still contribute to congestion. They will not help us meet climate change on their own. And so the best thing that governments really can do is to prioritize a more comprehensive mobility equity approach, which for us is focusing on moving people, not more cars, no matter if they're electric or not, right? Mm-hmm. And that means prioritizing investments in walking, biking, public transit infrastructure, again, that are targeted towards the people who need it most, the people who face the most barriers, the people who live in the most polluted communities that have been underinvested in and for so long. And at the same time, the government has to eventually begin phasing out any programs that continue to entrench our dependency on automobiles, again, electric or not. We have limited resources, and therefore we need to target it to the people who need it most and to a more comprehensive kind of vision of mobility.
Now, this is going to be a kind of a weird question, but sometimes I guess something that can be a tragedy can be turned into an opportunity. So obviously I guess we're still in this pandemic, hopefully coming out. And so would you say because of the pandemic, because people were, at least this is what I was reading. I don't know because I wasn't, I'm not a scientist, but I was reading a lot of reports because of the lack of movement. Like people were obviously driving less. They were not flying places. That some of the different things like water animals that we hadn't seen started to come out and obviously felt comfortable because people weren't around on the animal side. And then some of the water started to look a little bit cleaner. So would you say that the pandemic in a way helped, I guess, showcase that there is hope, or do you think that it actually hurt things from the environmental equity standpoint?
From a strictly environmental perspective, sure, maybe in the short term, we saw cleaner water or reduced air pollution. And in the long term, I think I'm a little bit less confident in that. I think specifically pointing to the drop in public transit ridership in this last year, hopefully it's just a temporary thing, but I think people may be a little bit more hesitant to get on a train with other people, even in a post-pandemic world. With more people working remotely, we may see a sustained drop in public transit ridership. And the fear there is that already our public transit agencies are struggling with a drop in fares. And we know that low-income transit-dependent people are going to be harmed the most by a drop in ridership, a drop in fare revenue, which ultimately means service cuts for public transit. So kind of looking at environmental equity impacts more broadly with kind of a lens on public transit, that's I think where my biggest fear is. And are wealthy people going to now prefer to drive to work instead of take the train? Is that going to lead to more long-term, transportation, greenhouse gas emissions? So that's obviously, kind of a very focused look on the transportation sector. But I think, unfortunately, unless we make big changes, that's the direction we may be heading.
Okay. Yes. Yeah, I was wondering because as I was reading all those different things, I was looking at things from just online, and then also one of my favorites. I'm a little bit of a nerd. National Geographic. They were looking at different places on the effects of the pandemic from environment. Obviously, it's just a moment. Obviously, when things are, I don't know if we're ever going to go back to regular normal, but when things get moving again, I guess that's what I will say. Those numbers probably will decline, and what they saw of things in improving for on the environment side. And so kind of leading a little bit away from that, but going into your report, is there a program that you would like to highlight, or would you like to stay away from highlighting any of the programs that were in the report that you think stand out to you?
Yeah, I can kind of highlight a little bit of the evolution of these programs. So maybe around 10 years ago, when California first started investing heavily in clean transportation technology, the kind of general strategy was to take a pretty prescriptive approach by providing financial incentives for people to purchase electric vehicles. So on its face, that's great. We really helped to develop and uplift an entire electric vehicle market. Unfortunately, when you look at who has benefited from that, the vast majority of beneficiaries from that policy are middle and wealthy income white people. Many of them who bought very fancy, expensive electric vehicles. And so from an equity perspective, like with our limited resources, that's not who needs those resources and incentives the most. And so kind of with that as background, the programs that I'd like to point to are ones that are moving away from a prescriptive approach, ones that are specifically targeted to low-income folks of color, and ones that are driven by individual community needs and recognize that an electric car does not work for everyone. That does not meet the mobility needs of many people. And so one program I'd like to highlight is the Sustainable Transportation Equity Project. This was probably one of the newest programs. It's 100% targeted to communities that suffer the most from pollution and poverty. And what it does is that it funds those communities to do a community-driven planning process to assess their needs, to figure out what kinds of mobility options best meet their needs. Is it electric vehicles? Is it public transit infrastructure or better bike lanes? And at the same time, this program also requires that there'll be a kind of interlocking complementary investments in anti-displacement measures, because we want to make sure that all these new technologies coming in doesn't have unintended consequences. There's also required climate adaptation plans, again, to make sure there's no unintended consequences of this investment. There's also required workforce development plans, because we know that every single investment can have positive impacts for green jobs and workforce development and training. And so then this program also funds the implementation of those plans, of those infrastructure, the mobility plans, the potential jobs and workforce training. And so this program has recently been awarded to, I believe, 12 communities across California to do the planning grant, and then to 3 communities to do the implementation grant. I believe in Los Angeles, Fresno, and the city of Stockton. And so this is a really innovative program. It's one that we're recommending be hugely increased in the amount of funding. We're recommending that it be replicated and scaled up on a national level, because it really provides a model of what could the most inclusive, equitable, innovative mobility program look like. One that's driven by community needs and is targeted to those who need it the most.
Okay. And so what would you say is often the greatest barrier to getting these programs implemented? Is it just money, or is it just people, or a combo?
There's so many factors that go into it. I would say, the first hurdle is getting policymakers, decision makers to allocate the sufficient amount of resources for it. But then another thing is that a lot of these programs are competitive grants. So cities, communities from around the state are competing with one another to win these grants. And the reality is that even though these are all targeted towards low-income communities of color, the communities that have just a little bit more resources, have a little bit more capacity, maybe a little bit more technical expertise, often win out on those competitive applications. And so we're even seeing inequities within these equity programs. So there's some barriers around making sure that every single applicant has the tools and resources they need to not only submit a competitive application, but to win those funds. And so a lot of the recommendations in our report are very specifically targeted to that. And at the same time, a lot of these programs require a partnership between a city, a community-based organization, community leaders, other groups. And that is something that's a little bit easier said than done. That requires trust, that requires kind of a structure for developing a inclusive and equitable partnership. And those things take time. It definitely does not happen overnight. But for us, like, that is what constitutes an equitable program.
So that kind of leads to the barrier that I always see when it comes to I'm just because obviously I'm not the mobility expert, but one of the things that I'm familiar with is from a real estate perspective. So obviously the population has grown, and in California there's a housing shortage and things like that, and obviously then builders and contractors have started to move into different neighborhoods, and then this brings up the whole thing of gentrification. And usually with gentrification, the communities that used to be low income or I'll just say had ethnic minorities in it often get pushed out, not just sometimes for financially, but just because it changed, is no longer their community, and the things that used to be common, such as ethnic grocery stores. Like I once read this article. I guess there were a lot of people who were going then to like the Spanish grocery store, and so then since everybody was going to the Spanish market because they had the best tortillas and they had these desserts, and then all of a sudden people wanted to start eating goat, and people never were eating goat before when they went, and then they started going to the markets, and the prices in the Spanish market, because of course the people were willing to buy more and the demand was more, started to go up. And so then the people who were used to be in that community could no longer even afford the food that was native to them because it started to become overpriced. And so the same thing, I guess, the fear that I always see with moving into this higher technology is that it starts to naturally just push out those that are low income, not because necessarily they don't want to, obviously participate, but they just can't, or in some ways, they like the old ways. So how do, I guess, as you were saying, for trust and building trust and these relationships, I guess, what would you say are the best ways that either like governments or cities, how can they go about building trust that this is not going to happen to these communities, that all of a sudden they're displaced and and they don't even recognize their own community anymore?
Yeah, so there's been lots of cases cited where electric vehicle charging stations pop up in these kind of, transitional neighborhoods where gentrification is kind of starting to creep in. And the original residents are like, well, what the hell is this? Like, this isn't for me. I don't have an electric car. Like, this is a very clear indication of gentrification. I don't like this. And completely understandably so. Like, no one probably asked them where they wanted the electric car charger to be. They've never even, heard of one. They don't know how they can access one. And so that's why we push for these community-driven clean mobility programs that are highlighted in the report, where those residents are deeply and intimately involved in shaping what those investments are going to look like. And therefore, we can be sure that the kinds of investments, whether that's simply, a sheltered bus station or a safer sidewalk, if they've been involved in deciding what kinds of investments should be instituted there, they're going to be like, that is for me. I was involved in that process. I'm, empowered in this process. And that's not to say that alone will not solve, displacement and gentrification. That's why it's important that these programs build in anti-displacement measures. But again, anti-displacement in a way that is community driven, because anti-displacement measures look completely different in every community. And so, cities have to recognize that it's important to make those investments without the unintended consequence of displacement.
I can say it's a tough one. So, yeah. Yeah, because just the grocery store thing alone, I was, when people can't afford the native food that they were used to at the, the Spanish supermarket. I remember reading an article about that, and I was like, that's sad. So I guess what would you say is the most important thing that you could that you see for the future in creating a more equitable environment? What's the most important thing?
I mean, obviously, I'm very biased. My world is very much the transportation sector within the climate space. But the reality is that transportation emissions are the number one contributor to climate change. But at the same time, the reality is that no matter if we stopped all emissions today, the climate is still going to change. We are going to have to adapt. We have to prepare now. We have to build more resilient cities in the face of these kind of really scary changes. And so I'd say that we both have to reduce emissions as fast as we can, but also come to terms with the reality that we're going to be living in a much different world. And government really has to provide the funding and the structures to help ensure that the most vulnerable populations, which again we know are low-income folks of color, who are going to be able to weather that storm.
Okay, perfect, beautiful answer. Well, thank you so much for informing us about clean mobility and about the different programs and ways that low-income individuals are affected, and how that it's all intertwined with economics and the environment, and that none of us, whether we are a low-income minority or not, that we are all in this together. I guess that's the tagline that we took from 2020. We're all in this together, and even more so with the environment. So thank you, Hana, for sharing that with us. And then I would like to know, for people who would like to dive in a little bit deeper into the report, I was reading the report and found a lot of the programs quite interesting, and excited to see some of them implemented in the future, as I'm here in California. How can people find out a little bit more about you? And then, of course, once they can go online, of course, to download this report. Can you let people know a little bit more about how they can find out more, or probably, or is there a way that they can maybe get these programs implemented or started, or talk to their politicians to get these implemented in their community?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the best resource is to just go straight to the report. Many of them, a community-based organization or resident group, are actually eligible to apply for funding through the state of California. And so I would encourage folks to look at some of those community-driven programs and see if they could do it on their own, but they could also partner with their city, with other government entity. And I would encourage you to also check out the other resources and reports on the Greenlining Institute's website. I have about 5 of them up there, so there should be plenty of reading material there. But yeah, there's definitely lots of resources on our website.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you again for your time and insight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. If you have a passion for an unserved community, a social justice problem, or simply want to change minds, contact Project Good Work at projectgood.work to start your project of change today. To our listeners, thanks for tuning in to Project Good, where we are focused on what matters.